Welcome to all who are joining again from the previous session. And also if anyone has joined but have not been in the previous one, it would be nice that you find the time to go through the first part, but of course you are welcome to continue, and I will highlight a few aspects so that those who joined just today are not confused about what is going on in this discussion. Ramayana is part of Veda. Veda is total knowledge. It comes from the ancient Vedic tradition. We can see the first slide. It just shows how Veda is written in Sanskrit and in English. And that is the term that means knowledge. So in different languages, it has different connotations, different ways of being expressed as knowledge. And in the middle, we see it written in Sanskrit, Ved, and Veda is the way it's told, Ved or Veda. That is total knowledge of natural law that comes to us from this very long tradition of Vedic teachers, Vedic masters, that we see in the next slide represented as part of what we call the Vedic tradition of teachers, of masters. And we see in the lower part of the chart, Gurudev under the umbrella, who is Maharishi's master, and Maharishi, who is the one who really brought to light all this knowledge from Gurudev and gave it to us, and who himself looked at the Veda in a scientific way and organized it in a perfect way. And he taught transcendental meditation as a way to reach the transcendent, where the Veda really is, which is the source of all knowledge, the source of all management and all expressions in natural law, come from a field, a unified field of the laws of nature that contains all that there is, and then emerge into the surface value in different expressions, as we see in the next slide. And this slide shows the unified field expressing itself into different fields of energy and matter fields and force fields, and then becoming atoms and molecules and then tissues, and then all the way up, as we see in the middle, to forming the human being and to even forming society. So all that is expressed on the surface value that we see here on the top of the chart comes from this one field of pure being and its fluctuations and reverberations, leading to the expressions on the surface value of people and animals and trees and planets and all that there is in creation. But all that there is in creation is organized and managed by this field, which has all the orderly functioning of the laws of nature that allow this manifestation to happen. Human physiology has been built completely in accordance with the laws of nature, which we say is Veda, and therefore is capable of diving deep, as we see on the right side, as we go from the surface towards the unified field, from the top of the chart towards the bottom, and experience the transcendental field of consciousness. The experience of the transcendental field of consciousness allows us to experience ultimately the pure, perfect being of silence, inner, quiet intelligence, which is totally transcendental and beyond the outer changes. But it has within it all the laws of nature lively. So it's a field of silence and dynamism. And that dynamism is fluctuations that is experienced by the Rishis, who are the seers of the Veda, and then expressed as sound in terms of what we know today as the Vedic literature and the Vedic sounds that are available in the Vedic literature and are chanted by the Pandits. And it is because we are Veda already, even on the physiological level, that we can align ourselves and we can dive in this field and be at the level of infinite quiet and peace and harmony and silence, even with our own physiology, because our physiology, when it is pure and has no more stresses, is completely in alignment with Veda, and therefore there is no contradiction and there is nothing abnormal. In fact, if there is something abnormal, through the process of diving, those abnormalities are removed, because the more we are attuned with these deeper levels, the stresses, what we call stresses, which are abnormal structures and functions of our system, our physiology, are removed and cleared, and therefore we align ourselves more and more, and we are totally aligned and we are fully in tune. We experience what we call cosmic consciousness, which is a state where transcendental consciousness is always there, because physiology and mind are in tune with that state. And even as we go through dreaming, sleeping, waking states of consciousness, we never lose the self, the inner being. So Maharishi organized these values of natural law as a perfect science. These are the 40 aspects of natural law expressed in a chart form that Maharishi has organized under columns of Rishi, Devata, Chandas, which is the seer, the process, and the object of seeing. So these are the values that we see in this chart. If we look through it, we find on the right column, if you go down a few, like 4 of them, you get to yoga. So yoga is one of them. You keep going on the right and go down to just the third below the end, and you find something called itihas. It is under Brahmana there. And this itihas is where the Ramayana is. Ramayana is in that part. Itihas contains 2 values, the Mahabharata, which is also an epic of natural law, a story of natural law. And it has the Ramayana, which is another aspect that tells the story of natural law. Now, all these aspects are contained within us. And just to have an example, as a refresher for those who are joining us, the next slide shows the book in which this has been presented. And in this book, there is all the research. And this one now looks at yoga with its different chapters and how they are related to different parts of the nervous system. And we can see this in the next slide also, where even the sutras within the yoga are distributed in different parts, different activities of the different chapters of yoga. If we look at another example, we have Nyaya, which is distinguishing and deciding quality of natural law. And here we see it corresponds to a part of the brain called the thalamus. This has 5 chapters there are in the Nyaya, and this thalamus has also 5 divisions within it, and it has many more subdivisions corresponding exactly 1-to-1 to the subdivisions of Nyaya, as we see in the following slide. There are 16 parts of Nyaya, and they correspond exactly to the 16 nuclei of the thalamus. And therefore, the thalamus represents both in structure and function, the structure and function of Nyaya. And like this, all the 40 aspects of the Vedic literature, as we can see, for example, in Rig Veda as a holistic value in the next slide, all these aspects that are available in the Vedic literature correspond 1-to-1 to our structure and function of our physiology. All the nerves, all the divisions of the nervous system, one by one, correspond to the structure and function of the human physiology and of the Veda, as well as we see in this slide that it has a correspondence also with the structure of our immediate aspect of the universe, going further out of the Earth into the solar system. We find that there are these planets in the solar system, and they happen to be within our brain, corresponding to the basal ganglia, not just in their structure with a central structure that represents the sun and all around it representing the other values, but even in how Jyotish, which is the science of prediction, describes these particular functions of these planets and their influence and what they do. And actually, this is how our basal ganglia also function. Now, all of this is part of our structure. So our structure is organized according to the 40 aspects of natural law. And it also functions according to natural law. It develops and grows according to natural law. And that's where the Ramayana comes. The Ramayana is a story, an epic, as we discussed in the previous session, a story that tells the story of natural law, of how natural law interacts with itself and how it unifies all its expressions into a holistic expression that lead ultimately to the experience of higher states of consciousness, cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, and ultimately unity consciousness. So the dynamics of functioning of all these values in our physiology is also available in the Veda, not just how each of them functions separately, but how they are integrated and how they function together to create that wholeness and that feeling of totality that ultimately allows us to live perfection in life and higher states of consciousness. So that is also available as a book that we can see in the next slide. It's called Ramayana and Human Physiology. And that book describes how all the characters, including not just human characters, but including even rivers and mountains and forests and different kinds of characters, which means we have the humans, we have the animal life, we have those that live under the earth, those that live on the earth, those that live in the air, like birds, that grow and fly and move in the air. We have stories of rivers, we have stories of interactions with higher developed sages and beings that we call Rishis. And then we have even divine aspects that are at the highest level of development. And all of them interact in a very, very smooth and perfect way, as we will see in some examples when we address the whole story of the Ramayana from, of course, certain examples, because it's a very big, detailed story, and it has many, many fine little details, and every one of them is very, very significant and very important. And therefore, that's why it takes a whole book to explain all of these details, even if the book actually itself is quite concise and doesn't go into very great explanation of physiology and Ramayana. Otherwise, it would be several volumes, and we are also planning to develop this for educational purposes, particularly for traditions in the East that are interested in the Ramayana and interested in human physiology, so they can learn the physiology on the basis of natural law, not just some gross, expressions of things and why they happen, how they happen, in a very superficial way, but in a profound way, so that we see that our physiology is a living, acting, developing, and growing and expanding actual Veda, actual laws of nature. But for now, we'll take some examples. And to start, we will first orient ourselves. As we will see in the next slide, our physiology has different layers, different levels. And what is very interesting is, when you look at the Ramayana, you will find that these characters and aspects that correspond to different values of natural law, as expressed in either serpents or animals or birds, rivers or rishis or humans or higher beings like devata, and values of higher control, higher aspect of natural law, they actually can be found to be divided in an orderly way. And this is really very interesting because that gives us a sense of consistency. There is a consistency and a relationship that makes profound sense on the level of organization. We see here in the chart that, for example, what is in the earth is in the abdominal area, and then what we can call humanity is in the chest area above the diaphragm. And this is where you will see all the actual individuals that are encountered in the Ramayana as simple individuals, living their life, but also animals that roam the earth and therefore are there. And also birds are there because we have that element of the lungs, which represents the air value. And you will see that in the Ramayana there are these big birds, these powerful birds that are very vital, in the same way as the lungs are very vital to give oxygen and to support the individual. And in the middle here there is the heart, which is the center of the nourishing value of the whole body. It is the heart that distributes the nutrients. It's the heart that distributes the oxygen. It's the heart that distributes the transmitters, the hormones, and makes things balanced, that takes things, in and out from the digestive system and nourish the whole physiology. And then as you go higher, we will see that we get to what you see here is called Rishis. Our nervous system, which is made out of different parts, you have the brain on the top, then you have a part which is called the middle of the brain or midbrain, that is a junction between the higher cortex and the lower values. Around the midbrain there is an area which is the limbic system, which is related to emotions and feelings and reactions of fear and protection and all of that. And then you have, as we said, the midbrain, and then you have the brain stem, which is the trunk that supports the brain. As you go lower, you have the spinal cord. So that is Physiology 101, but it's good to be reminded. And if you go in the species of animal development and development of different species, you find that the lower parts are available in the lower species, and as you go higher, just literally higher in vertical direction, you get more and more of the structures that are available. So the animals that are a little more evolved, they have more of the brainstem. Then as they are more evolved, they get more developed midbrain, then more developed upper parts, and finally those that are like humans and developed, they have a cortex, and that cortex is our area of conscious decision making, appreciation, sensation. This is how our senses get organized into knowledge, and how we predict the future and how we think. All of these are in the higher part of the nervous system on the top of the brain. So to have an orientation of what our activity is, there is the lower activity, the basic activity of eating and managing the physiology as a maintenance goes, the earthly kind of aspect. Then there is the humanity part with the heart and the lungs, and the birds are there. And then you have the rishis in the middle, which come at the level of the brainstem, and they are the connection between higher and lower, between the thinking value and the organizing value of the physiology. Of course, if you take rishis as a real individual, they will have most developed higher brain, but here we're taking it beyond just rishi who's living on earth and teaching, and in a way connecting the individual level of humanity to the heavenly life, which means the spiritual value, the higher values of consciousness, of experience. And therefore, this is why I've put heaven over there. That represents, in a way, the ability to be above the smallness and above the basic needs of life and think of higher values such as peace and harmony and happiness and love and creativity and evolution. So it's not like heaven as going into heaven, but it's the higher values, and then these higher values are connected to us through the Rishis. The Rishis therefore act as a very important transition. Why this is interesting? It's interesting because in the Ramayana, you have Rishis, you have humans, you have individuals of higher status, like when you talk about Ram, when you talk about Hanuman, when you talk about these very highly lofty creative power and intelligence, they are said to be as incarnations of a heavenly individuals, incarnations of a higher value of reality. And so, to be consistent, it would be nice if actually you end up finding these different aspects of the Ramayana in their corresponding kind of places. And that is really what happens as you start looking into the Ramayana in human physiology. You will see that from a scientific, if you like, perspective, there are challenges that are limiting factors to how you can construct the relationship between the Ramayana and the human physiology. You cannot just suddenly put maybe a devata in the finger and some rishi in the knee or something in the back and like that, and it's all over the place. And there has to be consistency, there has to be continuity, there has to be meaningfulness in every relationship. So it's not just finding places for things, and you can say, well, this functions like this, therefore I can put it here. This functions like that, I can put it there. But then you have to ask, how do they relate to each other? Why is this here? Why is this there? How they communicate with each other, how they work together. And therefore, this puts constraints on the actual research and the actual findings. And if you can fulfill those constraints, then you can be much more satisfied that the relationship is actually deep and profound and complete, and not just some haphazard, trying to put things places and making it fit by force, but it actually does represent natural law. And that's what the whole book, that the whole discovery explains in terms of these profound relationships. So this is just for general orientation. We can see in the next slide the Rishis, and they are there in different parts of the brain. They're mentioned in terms of numbers and letters. Mainly, maybe you see the letters here. And this is because the Rishis are in this part, which is the brain stem. And they are actually nuclei. They call them nuclei, which means a collection of neurons that perform specific functions. And the Rishis themselves have specific functions. And these functions correspond one-to-one to the Rishis that are present there. And it's very interesting that when Ram goes into the forest, he encounters the Rishis in a certain sequence. And it's not haphazardous. And what is really interesting is that these Rishis, as they are in the brainstem here, are also present in a certain sequence. And it's exactly the same sequence as is presented in the Ramayana. So here we get into really fine details of connectedness that is really very, very profound and very important. In the next slide, we'll have an idea about what is called the informant. So we're now getting to the court of Dasharat. You remember Dasharat is the father of Ram. And in the court of Dasharat, he had what we call informants. And these informants are actually the different sensory systems that bring information from the outer experience into the nervous system. Now, another aspect that we see in the next slide is also very interesting, is that another constraint that you have in the logic that you might present is that these individuals, they are not just independent individuals that are just performing certain functions. They are part of a family, they have relationships, they come from a certain descendants, they have their own progeny, and so that again puts constraints on you, because you can't say Kashyapa was something, it is there, and Ram was something, it is there, and Dasharat was somewhere else, and they fit very nicely, maybe the character of Ram, or the character of Dasharat, or the character of Kashyapa, and then you say, well, it's all very nice, I have three people, and they are there, and they fit nicely. The thing is, how do they relate to each other? Why is this considered the father of this, or the descendant of this, and this is the son of this, and like that? And this is how we see that there is also a very profound connection in the hierarchy and in the development of the nervous system and the relationship, as we see in this chart, for example. Kashyap is the ancestor of Dasharat. Dasharat, again, is the king who is the father of Ram, and he is a descendant of Kashyap. Kashyap is a Rishi, and therefore he is in the Rishi area perfectly. And then Dasharat is in the midbrain, in between the brainstem and the cortical area and the higher area of the brain, and is a ruler also on his own level. The midbrain is a powerful ruler of the activities of the physiology on a very profound level that are automated and taken care of in a way that is very precise. It rules over different functions that maintain body properly acting in its own way. And then he gets Ram, which is a higher value. And here we see what, if you would call it in scientific term, the phylogenetic relationship, which means the growing up, as we said, in the species. So there are automations in the lower species, and then there is higher rulership, and then there is the highest level of rulership that comes from the cortical area. And here we see the very perfect relationship between Ram and his ancestors, his father, Dasharat, and the ancestor, Kashyapa, who is a Rishi. We will go back to this briefly and see, for example, how the arteries function. So let's immediately ask ourselves, where is Ram? So we look at the general picture of the main characters. We discussed in the previous session the story of the Ramayana. And Ram is in the higher value of the cortical area. And Ram actually starts where we see him now, and that is the field where we can say is Ayodhya. Ayodhya is said to be the town in which Ram was born, and this is the town where he will reign. From there, he will reign over the entire territory. But he is born in that area, in Ayodhya. And in Ayodhya, there is a river that we can see in the next slide. It's called Sarayu. And I want to bring your attention to the shape of the river. Look at the river. This is taken from a map. It's not been drawn. It's just a regular map. And then we go back to the previous slide and look at this vein that is the middle cerebral vein, it's called, that is surrounding Ram. And look at the shape of this, and then let's look at the shape of the Sarayu again. And you will see that they are exactly the same or very similar. Of course, the vein in the brain can take a little move like this. The Sarayu can also change over historical times. But this is a significant aspect of the relationship that even not only on the surface value or not only on the physiological value, but what is interesting is that there are places on Earth, places on the planet that have special value, and it's because their structure and their function represent something very interesting and profound as far as natural law is concerned. And that's why there are places that are considered as important pilgrimage places or places on Earth that are powerful, that have spiritual value. And this is because of their structure. And their structure defines their function or inspires their function. And so everything has a meaning, everything has a correlation, and natural law expresses itself in our own human physiology as well as in the entire universe according to its own dynamics. And that's how you can actually appreciate and see this value of different aspects. Now, Ram, as we have seen in the previous slide, is in this part of the cortex, but with his brothers, he is also going to cover the entire brain, and he will be the ruler. Therefore, he will take over the entire activity of the different lobes of the brain. Another aspect, just to highlight and get oriented, of Ram is you see through the entire epic of the Ramayana, through the entire story, Ram and his bow and his arrows. This is a very fundamental aspect because everything he does, almost, of course, other than teaching and speaking and being wise and being compassionate and all the beautiful things that Ram displays, he displays his activity through his bow and arrow. And in the nervous system, in the physiology, the arrow and the bow are available in the vertebral column and in the nerves that go out of the vertebral column. Already the vertebral column, if you see on this slide, on the left is the shape of it. It is made like a bow, like that. So actually, the shape is exactly like that. The vertebral column itself is a bony structure, but out of this bony structure come all the nerves that manage the entire physiology. You know, when you move your hand, it's a nerve that has come out of the vertebral column from the spinal cord, and that goes to the muscles in your hand and then activate the muscles in your hand. So, and this activation is an electric activation and a chemical activation also at the terminal. But the transmission happens very fast and very precise. And that is the aspect of the arrow and the bow that we see in Ram. So it is really all internal, even though the arrow and the bow in the story is an external phenomenon. But ultimately, what activates the external phenomenon is the internal phenomenon, is the internal structure. It's the brain, the orientation, the precision that comes from higher thinking, and then projection into action. And projection into action is through these nerves that shoot the arrow, if you like, to the muscles, to the speech value so you can speak, to the different aspects of the physiological activity, and that also get information back from the outside. And that information back is represented in the Ramayana by the fact that every arrow that Ram shoots, it goes out, accomplishes the task of it, reaches the target, and comes back to the quiver. So the quiver of Ram is never empty. It's the fullness of totality is always there. And this return of the arrow is also available in the physiology in terms of feedback to the nervous system. When you act, when you move your hands, when you speak, there is an information that is going outwards to make things move, but there is immediately an information at the same time that comes back from the joints, from the muscles, from the sensory system, goes back to your nervous system to tell you what you have done. Otherwise, you don't know how it's moving. There is no coordination. And we call this a feedback or a sensory feedback input that goes back to the nervous system. And in fact, in order to act properly, you have to actually be able to feel properly, to sense properly. And in every action, there are two things that happen. Even in the brain, there is an activation of the motor area, and there is also an awakening of the sensory area at the same time, and they are coordinated so that action is always in tune with the intention, with the desire. And ultimately, when the whole nervous system is working perfectly, this action is in accordance with natural law, because we are natural law, and the entire nervous system will be working properly. And that's the whole story of the Ramayana, how the nervous system will actually connect with all aspects of reality, of our physiology, with all the dimensions, with the Rishis to allow them to perform their proper actions, which means all the activities of the brainstem, all the activities that control the automated functioning of the heart, of the breathing, of the hormones in the body, and then the digestive system and all of that, so that there is a wholeness that is much more than the sum of its parts, because it's the wholeness of the absolute, which we are. And that has to happen by integration, so that all parts work together in an integrated way. And that's how Ram takes over the entire functioning of the whole physiology, which means of all aspects of what's happening in the forest, what's happening in the rivers, what's happening with the birds, what's happening with the monkeys, what's happening with everything. And that is the story of the Ramayana, is the story of Ram going out and unifying, but not by removing diversity, but by enhancing and allowing actually diversity to flourish, and for each aspect to function fully in its full ability and be flourishing and functioning holistically, completely in its own specialty, but in tune with wholeness, in tune with totality. And as we see in the Ramayana, it is when this wholeness is lost, when an individual starts thinking from their own little small perspective, and they're not able to see the wholeness of reality, the oneness of life, the totality, then they become source of issues and problems. If they think from the level of wholeness, of totality, of fullness, then they are in tune with natural law, because natural law is everywhere and is everything. So acting against any aspect of natural law is actually acting in a way that is not in tune with it, because it is the one that expresses the flowers in their different colors and the trees and all of that. And so the Ramayana wants to bring everything back to wholeness, back to integration, back to totality. It's all nourishing, all powerful, and it brings everything back to wholeness. And that's the story of the Ramayana. Now, another important character, of course, very central in the Ramayana, is Sita, who is the Patni, which means the wife of Ram, the queen with Ram. And she is the incarnation of Lakshmi. Lakshmi is that value in the Vedic literature in Vedic science that represents the fullness of Prakriti, of the value of maintaining wholeness in the field of action, in the field of expression, in the field of reality. And that is really represented in our physiology by the heart, and its 4 chambers represented in Lakshmi by her 4 hands, and then she is giving always nourishment, as we can see here in the photo, and all beautiful and nourishing things. That's what the heart does. It takes in the blood and brings it back full of oxygen, full of nourishment, full of wholeness. And therefore, Lakshmi represents the nourishing power of the cardiovascular system, and at its core is the heart. But then the cardiovascular system distributes its nourishment through what we call the arteries. The arteries are aspects of the physiology that take the oxygenated, the nourishing blood and distributes it to the whole physiology. Then when the blood, has had its oxygen consumed and it has its nutrients, absorbed and taken, then the veins take the blood back to the heart, and they pass through the liver and through the digestive system, so they collect all the nutrients and all the oxygen and all that and sends it to the heart. And the heart now, cleans it up through the lungs, and then the left heart pumps it out back to the entire physiology to nourish it again. And so that is the 2-stroke value of Lakshmi. And if we look at the next slide, we see that Mahalakshmi is actually represented by 2 general values, Rama and Radha. And if you look at their details, you will find that they correspond to the very fine details of the heart and how it is structured. And therefore, this cardiovascular system in the Ramayana is represented by all the mothers that are nourishing power. In the Ramayana, they are represented by the cardiovascular system. In the center of it is Sita, representing Mahalakshmi, but all of these arteries that go out, they are actually individual personalities that are representing individual arteries, representing mothers in the Ramayana. And as being mothers, then you have a new constraint, a new limitation of how you can play with these mothers, where you can put them. Because the mother of Ram has to be the mother of Ram, the mother of Lakshman, the mother of Bharat, the mother of Shatrughna, this and that, the mother even of Ravana, and this and that. They have to be appropriately placed, and their number has to be correct, and they have to be in accordance with the relationships that they have. And it is really fascinating, absolutely amazing. When you look at the next slide, you see in this slide is great details of relation. You can't read it, but it's not the point of going through this. If you want to know the details and you're interested, you can actually look it up in the book, and you will see that by structure, by function, by relationship, it is exactly the same as what we call the aortic tree or the arterial system in its divisions and subdivisions. So when you see in this chart that, for example, one of the arteries divides into 2, and then there are different 2 branches, this is not haphazardous. This is how it is in the physiology. But if you look in the Vedic literature at the different mothers as they are expressed in the Mahabharata and also Ramayana, you will find that they correspond exactly one-to-one in the number of branches and the number of divisions. So like this mother had 2 daughters, this daughter had 3 daughters, and this daughter of them was the mother of this one, and the second daughter was the mother of that one, etc. You actually find that they correspond exactly to how the arterial system is built. I'll take just one example. You know, we said Dasharat had 3 queens that supported him, and these 3 queens each had, their sons, the 4 sons that were the sons of Dasharat. And we have said that Dasharat is in the midbrain, in this part of the brain that's in the middle. So now we say, well, where would these queens be? Where would they be if they are the sons, the wives of Dasharat? They should be around Dasharat. They should be near Dasharat. And then they should be able to distribute their caring, nourishing value to their specific progeny, in this case to their sons. And that's what we see in the next slide. We are going to look at the brain from the bottom part. And looking at the brain, we see in the middle is the actual midbrain. And if you can read in the very center and the top, there is like a heart-shaped circle. It's called a circle of Willis because the person who discovered it had that name. And it's made out of 3 arteries, and they form like a circle surrounding the midbrain. And the arteries then go to the different parts of the brain and nourish different aspects of the brain. For example, corresponding to Kaushalya, and Kaushalya nourishes the area, as we have seen in the first slide when we talk about Ram. It nourishes the area exactly where Ram is born, the Ayodhya area. We saw the middle cerebral vein, because a vein takes the deoxygenated blood and collects things like any defects or anything that are out of metabolism, that finish, that are cleared. It cleans them up, it takes them away. So this is the river. But here we have the middle cerebral artery, which is full of nourishment and oxygen, and we see it covering the area where Ram is. So the mother of Ram nourishes Ram. That's very natural. And then in the next slide, we see Lakshman. And again, why is Lakshman here? It's really precise. This is an occipital area, and Lakshman is said to have a very precise vision and targeting ability and all of that. And the next slide, we see that the mother of Lakshman, Sumitra, actually is that second artery that nourishes the area where Lakshman is. And then the next slide, we see Bharat in that area, and there is a reason and an explanation why Bharat is here. It really covers that cingulate gyrus and prefrontal cortex, because Bharat was always thinking of the future, thinking of Ram coming, what will happen, ruling in the name of Ram, and the love for Ram, and planning like that. And this is the area where these functions are actually performed. And again, the artery that nourishes that is the mother of Bharat, Kaikeyi. And that is how we find the relationship to be very, very profound. I'll give a couple of examples about Rishis. The first Rishi that teaches and trains Ram is Vishvamitra. And Vishvamitra trains him in precision, in balance, and he takes him to the forest. And in the forest, there was a Rakshasa that was making sound and noise, and the noise was disturbing. And like that, there is a story that is very precise, but it deals with sound. And Vishvamitra's actually is connected to what we call the vestibular system, which is the balance aspect of the nervous system. And this is where Ram is taught how to draw the arrow, how to balance the arrow, how to shoot the target properly. And therefore, it is again the nervous system getting attuned to a certain way of functioning, so taking over the balance. And in the middle of the ear, we have these semicircular canals, we call them. In them, there are water, actually fluid, and this is how we can feel balance. When we move the head, these fluids move, and they excite certain nerves, and we can tell by the movement, literally, the fluid moves like this, the nerve gets excited like that, move forward, then the nerve gets excited like this, and that gives us an idea of our position in space and our balance. So it's both related to hearing and to the balance value. This is the middle of the ear and connected to the vestibular system. And when you look at the story of what happens when Ram was being trained, you see this value of sound, this value of movement, of water, of balance is all precisely describing the functioning of this system. Another Rishi is Agastya. That is one of the last Rishis there that plays an important role during the battle. Just to give an example, one illustration that we want to take that is just to show the value of the Ramayana in the human physiology and how it explains these very unusual, unexpected stories. How can they be explained through the functioning of natural law in our human physiology? So we now understand the value of the Ramayana, the main functions in the Ramayana, and the relationship of the main characters and where they are in general, in a very, very simplified general way in the Ramayana. One of the main occurrences in the Ramayana is that Sita was abducted, taken away from Ram. And in this event, one can see that Ram is really anguished and anxious and angry. And one can say, how could that be that such a highly developed soul, highly developed incarnation actually of wholeness, of totality, can display so much anxiety and anger and want to destroy everything and all of that? And the reason is that it's simply that the heart is taken away, because Sita represents the heart, is taken away from Ram. And if the heart is taken away, it means there is like a shunting system where the blood is not coming back to the nourishment of the nervous system as it should be. And everybody knows that if you cut the supply of oxygen from the nervous system, it gets agitated, it fights. And therefore, this is why this event happens. It just shows the importance of maintaining the heart connected to that process of continuation of wholeness to take over all aspects of manifestation. In the physiology, it's the importance of maintaining the sustaining value of the nervous system through the feeling, through the fine feeling value. And contradiction to that, an opposition to that, prevention of that is unsettling to the nervous system, unsettling to the physiology. So wholeness has to maintain that value, and that is why there is this big fight, in fact, to take back the heart so that it functions in tune with the needs of the physiology. And as that is as a central part of what Ram is claiming and wanting, as one is growing and developing in one's life, one is first learning how to walk, learning how to balance oneself, as we have seen in the training of Ram with Vishvamitra. So these are steps of development that we all go through. And then there are steps of development where we have to start taking into consideration outer values and making sure we have good business, we have good values, we have the mind is acting, the intellect is acting, but also the heart has to be there, the feeling has to be there, the compassion has to be there, which means the ability to take care of wholeness, because heart also means love and care and compassion. And these are values that are binding values of differences in natural law. So where there are differences, how can they be bound together? How can they be maintained together so that they act in a holistic way? And in life, we encounter differences, we encounter opposing values, and we have to know how to manage them and how to put them together and how to allow all variety to express itself and yet maintain the wholeness. And for that, we need a very fine level of feeling, and we need the nourishment of natural law. We need the maintenance of that quality, which is represented by Prakriti, which is represented in this case by the physical heart. So, to continue, after that, Ram now has to recover Sita. She has been abducted. He had his moment of suffocation, but he regained himself, came back onto himself, but he still, in order for the purpose of his journey, of his exile and all that he's doing to be fulfilled, he has to recover Sita and he has to adjust those values that are out of his control, out of the control of wholeness, out of the integration and comprehensive value. So then he goes back to himself and moves into the forest. And this is where he encounters Hanuman. So he's moving, he encounters many things. He encounters the bird, and that means the lungs, and how the lungs were burned. So all of this is completely supportive of this idea of, losing the nourishing value. There is a big bird that is Garuda and others like that are also represented in the physiology. And there is a number of events that happen, but we cannot go through all of them. I want to highlight this one event because in a way it has lots of fantastic, extraordinary aspects to it, and it would be hard to imagine how could this make sense in terms of a book that is a spiritual book, that is a philosophical book, educational book. And then why are these stories being told? So I take this example to highlight the importance of this relationship between Ramayana and human physiology and its significance in this case, and how it tells the story of natural law. So, Sita is abducted, Ram goes through certain things, and then moves into the forest in the direction of trying to find where Sita is. And there is a king of the Vanaras, which we talked about in the previous session, the monkeys which have supernatural power. And the name of that king is Sugriva, and he had with him the most powerful of all these Vanaras. Let's call them monkeys for now. And it's supernatural beings that have kind of a monkey quality to them because they jump, but they have very powerful abilities, the ability to become very big, the ability to become tiny and go even through the hole, even under the door, the ability to burn a city, the ability to fly in the air, to go in the water, to bring a mountain, to heal, and all of that. So unbelievable power and ability, all exemplified in this character that we call Hanuman. But the actual chief of the Vanaras, there are two of them. There is Sugriva and there is Vali. And they have a story. So we'll come to the story. So Ram moves into the forest, and Sugriva feels that Ram is coming. So he gets scared. Who is Ram? What is he doing? Why is he coming? So he sends Hanuman to figure out who is this king or this man coming into the forest. And it's his area. He's afraid because he had a fight with his brother. He's afraid maybe his brother sent him or something, so he wants to know what's going on. So Hanuman comes to Ram and immediately recognizes him. He recognizes him as being wholeness, as being Ram, as being the incarnation of Vishnu, as being the divine value, the heavenly value, as coming from that supreme value. And immediately he surrenders to him and gives him all his devotion and support, and brings him to Sugriva and explains to Sugriva what is happening. And of course, in this story, we see that Hanuman is recognizing the wholeness coming in. So who is Hanuman? Who are the monkeys? The monkeys turn out to be the hormones in our nervous system, in our physiology. In all our physiological functioning, we have messengers in form of chemicals or hormones that perform different kinds of functions that maintain our physiology properly balanced, maintain the homeostasis, maintain the balance of activity of practically every aspect of the body, the rhythms, the secretion of cortisol, which is another kind of hormone. And all of these are represented by the monkeys. They have supernatural power because these hormones are involved in many things. They're involved in digestion as transmitters and enzymes also, activating them and secreting them. And therefore, this is part of what we can say the example of how these monkeys can burn things, because they can actually metabolize things. And that burning process is a fire-related process. In our physiology, it's the pitta. And therefore, they can activate the pitta. They can increase the metabolic rate. They can burn the food, which means metabolize it and absorb it. And they can go through very tiniest holes to act on receptors. And yet, as a group, they can act over the entire physiology. So they can actually feel huge and big. They have a healing power. They have the ability to bring happiness. They are messengers. They take the message from one part to the other to tell the body what it needs to be done. So the hormones as a whole really represent all the functioning of the nervous system and the physiology and the glands and the heart and the lungs and the digestive system. And they represent these Vanaras, which is the monkeys that are represented in the Vedic literature, in Ramayana in particular, as the hormones. And the most powerful one representing them all is Hanuman, who, in recognizing Ram, recognizes the value of wholeness coming to take over the functioning of the hormones. Because in the nervous system, we have different parts and they are interconnected, and the hormones have their own activity. Some of it is autonomous, and therefore they have their own rhythms, and each different gland works on different aspects separately. But the nervous system integrates them. So as you go higher and higher in the brain, you get what we call the psychoneuroendocrino value, psychoneuroendocrinology, which means from the mind to the actual nervous system, and then through the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, from the pituitary gland, the control of all the hormones in the body. And although these hormones are controlled by separate master hormones, they need to be coordinated together. And that is what the value of Ram, the value of wholeness, the value of an integration of functioning allows the physiology to do. Otherwise, if you have too much of one hormone, too little of the other, then there can be dysfunction. And in this event that we are going through now in terms of the story that will be continuing, there is an imbalance that is not yet integrated, which means during the process of growth and development, there are, an adolescent time in life where there are hormones that start being secreted, and they can be all over the place sometimes, and they create this kind of, adolescent kind of revolt and feeling funny or, all kinds of things until all of this is stabilized. So we can see this as part of the adolescent period in life, in the development, where there is a conflict of the actual system of hormone is not yet fully integrated. How is this so in the story of the Ramayana? And now is the story of the masters of the hormones. And of course, in the Ramayana, they call them the kings, because master of the hormone is a master gland, but they are the kings, the rajas, the controllers of the hormones. And here is a very interesting story how this is being related. When you get to that chapter in the Ramayana, and you look at, even in the Purana, at the origin of these values, you get the following story. Brahma, who is considered as the creator, had a son. The son is called Riksharaja. Riksharaja was born from the tears of Brahm. Tears refers to water, and water flowing with some essence in it, not just pure water, but it has something in it, some minerals at least. And the tears were flowing in the hand of Brahma. And tears can represent happiness, can represent sadness, loss and all of that. But one thing they certainly represent is the fluidity, the water value that flows. And in the story, it says it flows through the hand of Brahma. And from that, Riksharaja was born. So this is already an indication that we are talking about something fluid. And the hormones, they move in the fluid. They move always, transmitters and all of that. They move in the plasma, they move in the blood, they are distributed through the blood. It's not through wires like nervous system electrical firing, but even actually the electrical firing of the nervous system happens through ionic changes, but we don't need to go into details of that. So even the electrical passage of electricity is happening through ions, positive and negative, that create this flow of electricity through the nerves. But all of these transmitters and hormones pass through fluids, through gaps and through fluids where there is plasma or fluid or cerebrospinal fluid somewhere, and depends which part of the body and nervous system you are. So already we can see that the origin of the Vanaras, which means those monkeys, and their progenitor is Riksharaja, who is the ancestor, the supreme king, if you like, of the monkeys, is related to water and watery things. So that's very interesting and very beautifully fits with our story. Riksharaja had two sons. One son came from his head, it's said, and another son came from his neck area. And the one that came from his head is called Vali, and the one that came from his neck is called Sugriva. And Sugriva and Vali worked together very nicely, very perfectly, and they were working very nicely until there was a disruption. Each had his wife, his family, his situation, and all of that. But Vali was the dominant chief, the dominant king, but we were both kind of having no problem. And Hanuman, of course, the hormones and all of that, was working with both of them happily. Until there is an Asura. An Asura is, let's call it an abnormality, an imbalance that happens. And this Asura has actually in his name and the roots is Maya, which is illusion, but that's another story. We don't want to make the story too long. This Asura disrupted the balance. They started to disrupt the balance. So in a sense, we can say the Maya, the illusion, and discontinuity of wholeness created an imbalance. And so both Vali and Sugriva together wanted to adjust this situation by getting rid of this imbalance, by getting rid of this Asura. The Asura is an unusual being that it is said has, doesn't even have blood in their body, or if they have blood, it looks like milk. It's a milk kind of thing. And that's a detail, but I'm saying it because it has an implication on the story. The Asura ran away and came to a cave and was hiding in a cave. And Vali, who is the more powerful king, the brother of Sugriva, told Sugriva, maybe you should stay at the door of the cave, and I'm going to go in and I'll fight the Asura. If I kill him, you will see milk coming out. Then you are good. You wait for me. We go back. We've resolved the problems. If you see blood coming out, it means he has killed me. And therefore, I don't want you to be killed yourself because it means he's very powerful. So what you should do is put some stones, some rocks, and cover the entrance of the cave, and then go home, take my wife as your wife also, protect her and the progeny, and rule over the monkeys. And so Sugriva said, yes, fine, I'll do that. And he waited, and suddenly Vali actually was able to kill the Asura, and the milk started coming out, but just before he died, the Asura had a magical thing, and he turned the milk into blood color. So when this blood came out of the cave, Sugriva said, my brother has been killed, and he told me to block the cave with the rocks. So he blocked the cave with the rocks quickly, and he went, took care of the family, took the wife of Vali and his wife and all of that, and he ruled. But actually, it wasn't the Asura that died, it was the Asura that died, it wasn't Vali. So Vali was able gradually with time to push the rocks out and come out and went back. And he thought, probably my brother Sugriva tried to take advantage of the situation and thought he could block me and then take the kingdom for himself and take my wife and take my family and take everything. So he came and he fought Sugriva, and he put his foot on his head and all wanted to kill him, but then let him go and tell him he's vanished. Now, Hanuman, who sees that it's unfair, decided to go with Sugriva, and that is why when Ram came to the forest, it was Hanuman and Sugriva that met him there. So they told the story to Ram, and now Ram wanted to solve the situation and take care of it and resolve what has happened. Before we get to that, we see this fantastic story and we think, what is this? What on earth is this? How can this be something of a value? What does it mean? I mean, we can try to take some wisdom from it or some, understanding. It's an interesting story. But how could this ever be something of a value in terms of our physiology or natural law? And when we look at the details, we find a real amazing, perfect correlation with how our hormonal system works and the balance between the different parts of the hormonal system and the activity of the physiology, even during this phase of adolescence and passing into adulthood and reorganizing the hormones and all of that so they function properly. Let's see where and what this means and the details and how they correspond exactly to the story. I will tell you the story of the nervous system in terms of the hormones, and I guess everyone would start immediately to see the correlation even before I make it myself. So now we shift to physiology. The hormonal system, which means the secretion of the hormones, is done by different glands in the body. Gland is a tissue that secretes some molecules that are transmitters usually, that secretes them directly into the blood. And they travel through the blood and they reach the cells, all the cells of the body, and they activate them in different ways. Different cells have different receptors, so different hormones act on different parts of the body and produce different effects. There is growth hormone that helps us to grow. There is vasopressin that helps to raise blood pressure when it's needed. There are cortisol that fights inflammation. There is thyroid hormone that modulates metabolism and all of that. So these different functions are taken care of by the hormones through the secretions of these glands. But the glands themselves are controlled by a master gland. The master gland is called a pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a small gland that is in the middle of the nervous system. If you look from between the eyebrows, somewhere there, and go straight in, and you make a line in the middle also, straight in the middle from top, you fall on the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is made out of two parts. There is the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, which is lower, comes when the embryo is born and the embryo is developing and then the child is born. It comes from the neck area, from the palate area, and climbs up towards the nervous system. That's called anterior part of the pituitary. The posterior part comes actually directly from the nervous system, from the brain area, from the neuronal area, and projects down, and they meet together, and together they form what we call the pituitary gland. But they are very different. The anterior pituitary gland is not connected to the nervous system directly through nerves. It receives its connection by blood arteries, small arteries and blood veins and all that, which is called the portal system, that feeds it from the top, whereas the posterior is directly connected to the nervous system. Now, this pituitary gland sits in a place which is called sella turcica in the cranium. The cranium is the bony structure of the brain, that covers the brain, the bone, the skull. And if you come to the bottom part, at this part of the level, there is actually like a cave, literally a cave, that is dug into the bony structure, and in this cave sits the pituitary gland. It sits in the cave, and it has this lower part and its upper part, or the anterior part and the posterior part, that correspond to the different aspects of hormones, different parts of functioning of the nervous system, as it connects itself to the hormonal system. So there is neuroendocrine, which means nerves connecting to glands, and the master gland, the king of the glands, is the pituitary gland. It connects to the hypothalamus connects to the limbic system connects to the cortex, and so the cortex ultimately balances all these activities and allows this proper coordination between the hormones. When the mind is settled, the person is transcending and has an integrated functioning. All of this works in perfect order. But when there is emotion and this and that and fear or this, all these hormones get very activated when we go through, childbirth, when we go through different phases of our life, the cycles of day and night. All of these influence this functioning. And if it is left to kind of outside elements and to itself, it really can get out of tune, and it requires coordination and integration. One aspect of these hormones that is related to the posterior and anterior pituitary gland, and it's interesting because of the story, is the secretion of milk. For example, when a cow secretes milk, there is a hormone, prolactin, that helps to produce the milk, but there is another hormone, oxytocin, that helps to eject the milk of the cow. And they're also related to desire, to growth and developing emotions and feelings and attraction and attention and all of that happen a lot, when we go through the adolescent period of change before we get into balanced adulthood in terms of relations and all of that. And now we can see the interesting actually connection and similarity between the stories. First, the Sugriva and Vali, their birth, they come one from the head of Riksharaja and the other from the neck of Riksharaja. It's exactly the same as the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. The posterior comes from the head, and the anterior comes from the inner part at the level of the palate, almost the neck area, and goes up to mix with it. So now we can tell exactly that the anterior pituitary gland represents Sugriva, and the posterior pituitary gland represents Vali. And they sit, their main transaction happens in this sella turcica, which is a cave, a real cave, that is present in the skull, in our own physical skull. And then this relationship between blood and milk is directly related to these two important hormones that are secreted one from this side and one from that side. And the fact that the hormone is secreted directly in the blood is an interesting analogy, not only analogy, correspondence between what we have seen in the cave and what we have seen in the dynamics of what happens in the relationship between these different parts of the pituitary gland. It's not, of course, the point to go into the fine details of the hormones and how they work, but there are many, many fine details where if there is an imbalance, for example, in that area, there can be bleeding. During, for example, childbirth, women can have, in some cases, engorgement of these arteries, and that can destroy parts of the pituitary gland, and that leads to complications in hormones and in life. So we don't need to go into that, it becomes too technical. The main thing that we're aiming at is to have a feeling, an idea of how exactly and precisely the Ramayana is actually playing itself in our own human physiology. Or, if you like, how our own human physiology plays the story of the Ramayana within itself, even on a physical, hormonal, neurological, neural level, pulmonary level, heart level, and all of these different levels. And here we are taking only one aspect, one detail, one story, just to illustrate this and see how something that looks fantastic and out of this world actually is the representation of mechanics of natural law growing into itself and adjusting itself. And that's taken care of by wholeness overtaking the physiology, because it is Ram who is going to solve the problem. And it's very interesting because before Sugriva and Hanuman take Ram to Vali so that they can solve the problem, Sugriva asks Ram a question because he's worried that maybe Ram might not be strong enough to fight with Bali, who is a very powerful king and has his control over the hormones, and it can shake things up and all of that. And he tells him, my brother Vali can shoot 7 arrows in a very fast sequence, and with each arrow hit 7 of the 7 chal trees that are one next to the other or around each other, and with just one arrow each, so 7 arrows one after the other in a fast sequence, he can shoot all of these. So can you do that? Just telling you this so you know how fast and how precise my brother is. So Ram takes 1 arrow, not 7, and shoots the arrow, and the arrow hits all the 7 trees, not just one tree for 1 arrow, but the arrow goes through all the 7 trees and then goes in the subterranean region and hits all the 6 subterranean regions, and from the 6 subterranean regions goes to another central subterranean region, even deeper than that, and then comes back to his quiver. And of course, Sugriva is completely amazed. But, you know, for the sake of one more example, what does this mean? Actually, in the brainstem, where this whole thing is supporting the function of action and connection, there are 7 columns. You know, if you look at them carefully, we represent them as also the Sapta Rishis, the 7 Rishis. There are 7 columns of neurons that have different functions for physiological activity, for behavior, for even digestion and different actual physiological outer and inner activities. And they are related, of course, in different ways to the hormonal functioning, because the hormones can target any of these activities of the physiology. So it is natural that Vali can control with all his activities, can control, but separately, each of these columns in the higher level of the nervous system, and therefore can shoot his activity and control these values, which are called, in this case, trees, because actually, if you see them, they are like columns, and then they spread out their nerves, and they become literally like trees, spreading out its branches, each spreading out its branches. And so the hormones can obviously hit one after the other, but there are different hormones that hit different activities within these values. Whereas the central nervous system, where Ram is in the cortical area and the control of action and decision making, when it is integrated, it can send impulses in one go that actually can be spread out to control all of these values together, and even more, go further down to the control of what is in the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, there are again columns and areas. If those who remember, they are called layers of Rexit. And on each side of the spinal cord, there are 9 layers of Rexit. And in the middle, there is one which is called periaqueductal gray. But out of these 9 on each side, there are 3 on each side that are related to motor action, to motor activity. And therefore, 3 on each side make 6. And these are the 6 subterranean regions. And then the periaqueductal gray, which is another column but surrounding the center of the spinal cord, is the 7th subterranean region, which means below the level, at the lower level. So it shows that Ram's activity can span all of these values with one intention of wholeness. Everything is taken care of simultaneously. And that is the beauty of wholeness taking over everything. So these are a few examples that illustrate. We can see in the slide, if you like, just for illustration, slide 33, that shows the presence of Sugriva and Vali and their functions. We don't need to look at it more, or even at the slide, as also time is passing. But Angada, if you see on the top, is the son of Vali, and when Ram solved the problem and put Vali into balance, he promised him that he takes care of his son and ultimately makes him the ultimate ruler once all of this is resolved. But that's a detail. And the final remarks is, we are an embodiment of total natural law. The Veda is natural law. Ramayana is the story of natural law. And all of its characters and realities, even the rivers, we haven't shown some rivers, but there are rivers. There are bridges, and the bridges are there, the rivers are there, the trees are there, the animals are there, the humans, the exceptional creatures are there, and they all work together and are ultimately assembled together as Ram ultimately defeats Ravana and takes Sita back and creates Ayodhya as Ram Raj, which means an orderly functioning where wholeness dominates, where all the hormones work in coherence together, all the different parts of the nervous system, all the different parts of the heart, and the lungs, the birds representing the air and flowing in the air and transportation of nutrients, all the digestive system, which are all of the different values of levels of function that come together to create beautiful physiology that is created in the image of the divine, in the image of wholeness, that is incarnation of total natural law, incarnation of Veda, as it develops and grows and gets balanced, when wholeness is the guiding light, the guiding power, as we have received from Maharishi and the entire holy tradition, the technology to develop that wholeness through transcending, going back again and again to the self, where all the laws of nature are, enlivening that, and that we have seen enlivens the functioning of the nervous system. That's why we see greater coherence in the nervous system, right, left, front, back, as the scientists have shown. And this integration shows that there is a holistic functioning, and that Ram has taken over the rulership of our physiology, which means wholeness. Ram, Brahm, Paramarat Rupa. Ram is the totality. Ram is wholeness. Ram is fullness. Ram is totality. And that Ram is embodied in ourself and takes over all the entire functioning of the physiology, as well as through the group practice of transcendental meditation and the advanced techniques, siddhis, and all the techniques, we create the same reality in the society. Because also as society goes, the Ramayana is also there, is being lived there. And different phases of history, different phases of life might be living different aspects of the Ramayana, different phases of the Ramayana, different chapters of the Ramayana, different sub-chapters of the Ramayana. And which chapter are we living? It doesn't matter. We have the solution that allows us to live Ram Raj, to create orderliness, to create integration, comprehension, balance, and association with totality, with wholeness, so that all are enjoying fullness, everything functions perfectly, but in tune with everything else. And that is what the story of Ramayana is about. It's about wholeness permeating everything, yet allowing everything to be itself, to be different, to be special, to do its function, but on the basis of one unbounded ocean of intelligence, one unbounded ocean of consciousness in motion. That's the gift of Maharishi, that it's not only a theoretical thing, but a very practical, real technology to create wholeness and experience fullness and live it on the individual level, and for all society to be invincible, the family of nation to be in peace and happiness, and life can be lived in fullness when life for the individual and society is lived on that highest level of Ram Raj, heaven on earth for everyone.